Okay, well, this is the final instructor produced YouTube video for Module 2. It's Module 2, Part 6. And here we'll be covering Chapter 4 in the Hahn textbook, the role of society and culture in sickness and healing. So again, you want to have your textbook handy. We'll be reading quotes from time to time. All right, so the important point here is that one's sociocultural environment greatly affects and influences the way one perceives their world, and so obviously it's going to have a great influence on the way they perceive sickness. And we just cannot overlook the importance of this fact, especially as it is relevant to ethnomedicine. There's a quote on page 76 I'd like to direct your attention to. And it's just a statement that's made. It's in the second paragraph, 6 lines down. In the second paragraph on page 76, sociocultural effects are causal in the same way that environmental carcinogens, toxins, and bacterial and viral pathogens are. Now, Hahn then goes on to describe 3 different types of interaction that occur between sociocultural factors and biological factors in regard to sickness and healing, and he calls these construction, mediation, and production. Let's look first at construction. First, we need to make the point here that people actively construct their sociocultural ideology, and this construction is based on biological survival, psychological needs, emotional needs, and so forth, and therefore it's going to differ from culture to culture. So we need to understand something about the culture itself before we can understand sickness and healing in that culture. So here we're talking primarily about enculturation, which is the process whereby a person learns their culture, and socialization, the sort of process whereby a person learns to be a proper social being in their culture. There's a quote on page 77 that's relevant here, and it's in the second paragraph below the heading, starting with the second line. The culture of a society constructs the way societal members think and feel about sickness and healing. That is to say, the members of a society are taught by others about different sicknesses and their names, their characteristic symptoms and courses, their causes and mitigating circumstances, their cosmological and moral significance, and appropriate responses. What counts as sickness may differ from society to society, and given conditions of sickness are understood in very different ways. So, for example, consider spirit possession and demon possession and exorcism and things of that nature. For an individual who's raised in a strictly fundamentalist deliverance ministry household, they will assume that there's a demonic influence behind virtually everything that is wrong with them and their world. And so whatever the problem may be, the diagnosis is there's a demonic influence, perhaps even possession. And so they will seek out an exorcist to rid themselves of the problem. Well, on the other hand, imagine someone that's raised in a strictly secular context, and in fact, they could be suffering from the same issues and never invoke the hypothesis of demonic possession. And then they will act accordingly. They will not be seeking out exorcists. They'll perhaps be visiting a psychiatrist or a psychologist. We could compare, for example, the sort of common thinking during the Middle Ages, at which time virtually all psychological maladies and dissociative events and psychoses, such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, Tourette syndrome, were all diagnosed as spirit possession, or more negatively, demonic possession, and the cure was always thought to be exorcism. Whereas fast forward about 700 years, and today the very same conditions are diagnosed as being psychological, some cases biochemical, and we treat them with medicine. So the way people perceive of their world has a great bearing on the way that they perceive sickness and healing. So that's the notion of construction. Secondly, there's a notion of mediation. The idea here is that by virtue of engaging in certain activities, we become susceptible and vulnerable to certain diseases and certain maladies. So, for example, imagine a hunting and gathering tribal group, which is mobile and living pretty much day to day, and compare them with a more settled, sedentary group whose subsistence is based on plant and animal domestication. We can see that in both cases they're going to be susceptible to a variety of different maladies and conditions based on their lifestyle. For example, we have a whole branch of medicine called sports medicine in our culture because people, given the different kinds of activities people are engaged in our own culture, we're exposed to problems that people in other cultures wouldn't necessarily suffer from. And on page 77 and 78, there's a quote regarding mediation. Look at the very bottom, page 77. Mediation, a second mode of sociocultural influence on sickness and healing, is perhaps the best recognized of sociocultural effects. The concepts, ideas, and values of a society's culture guide the behavior of societal members, distributing them in time, space, and activity. The members of a society live in certain kinds of dwellings and certain kinds of communities. They pursue diverse occupations and social and recreational activities. By such guided movement, they are brought into greater or lesser contact with pathogenic sources. Thus, sickness may be fostered or prevented. And then finally, we have production. And in this case, the idea is that cultural beliefs themselves may be pathogenic or therapeutic. So, for example, consider the voodoo death phenomenon that we discussed in one of the other modules. In this case, a person is sort of predisposed towards believing that they can suffer horribly from sorcery. So their cultural beliefs in that case can be pathogenic. They can be negative. There's also something here referred to as the placebo effect that we'll get into a little bit later. And that's the phenomenon whereby a person is enculturated in such a way that they trust authority to the extent that they can be given, for example, a sugar pill, which is an example of a placebo, and actually benefit from it. Certainly they think they benefit from it, even though it's not real medicine. It's totally inactive biochemically. So that's an example of production. Cultural beliefs themselves can cause sickness, or they may actually also be therapeutic. We might also mention faith healing here as well, at least from a skeptical sort of anthropological perspective. It's the performance itself. It's the trust in the person doing the healing that actually brings about the healing. Just as in exorcism. The reason why exorcism is so effective cross-culturally is because there is a lot of faith and a lot of confidence placed in the exorcist themselves. And so what we're talking about here is psychotherapeutic healing. Of course, we're going to cover exorcism a little bit more later in a little unit on that. But what we're talking about here is psychotherapeutic healing. A person is predisposed to believe that they will be healed by virtue of either a faith healing ceremony or an exorcism. So that's production. He makes a no, let's move on from those three types of from those three ways that sociocultural factors and biological factors can interact. Moving on now, Hahn notes that a presence that for sickness to occur, a pathogen is of course often necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient, which means you could have the same pathogen introduced in two different societies, yet it's not necessarily the case that sickness will occur. And that, of course, is because of the different cultural ideologies people are working with. Okay. There are a variety of examples that illustrate the effect that society and culture themselves have on sickness. And he discusses a few of these. And here we're on page 80. Hahn points out that Per capita income, for example, in any nation correlates very highly in a positive fashion with infant mortality and longevity. And of course, per capita income is strictly a social or cultural factor. Also, too, within particular societies, socioeconomic status correlates with the quality of the health care they receive, and therefore socioeconomic status can have a direct impact on sickness and health. Again, another cultural or social factor. Hahn discusses South Africa because this is an interesting example of what he's talking about here. South Africa had in place what was called apartheid, A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D, which in the Afrikaners language just means something like separateness. Anyway, the apartheid social system lasted from 1948 to 1993. A very small European minority, primarily Dutch, from Northern Europe, actually dominated and controlled a large native or African black majority, and the system was horribly racist, horribly discriminatory, and of course the native Africans suffered in lots of different ways. How did they suffer? Well, here are some examples. During apartheid, and Hahn provides us with some of this data, I'll just look at a few of the things he refers to. During apartheid, for example, life expectancy for native African blacks was 62 years, and for the European whites was 71 years, almost a 10-year difference. Tuberculosis rates were 59 times higher amongst the natives than they were amongst the white European population. And not surprisingly, in the black community there was one physician for every 90,000 people, whereas in the white European community there was one physician for every 400 people. Of course, malnutrition and unsanitary living conditions were all present in the so-called townships where the native African population was forced to live. So we can see in this case that social structure and cultural ideology greatly impacted health and sickness. The apartheid system, by the way, did end in 1993, and Nelson Mandela was elected the first president of the Free Democratic Republic of South Africa. In the United States, we had something similar going on before and somewhat after the Civil Rights period. So, for example, about 25% of black families lived below the poverty level, whereas only 7% of white families did. In the black community, people succumbed to medically preventable conditions at 4.5 times the rate than that of white communities, and infant mortality was over twice as high in black communities as opposed to white communities. So again, obviously all these things had an adverse effect on the general health of the black population, and obviously again we see a social or cultural factor having a great influence on sickness and health. Also too, social relationships on a more personal level can affect health and sickness. In a study shown in California, for example, Hahn discusses this on page 87, it's shown that men and women with the lowest social indexes were more likely to have died when compared with their counterparts with the highest indexes. So basically, if a person has a rich social life, then they are more likely to live longer than those with the low social index, meaning that they don't have many social contacts. It's also suggested that those with higher social indexes have a higher resistance to disease. And again, these are both blatantly cultural factors. Other studies show that widows and widowers are more likely to succumb to maladies like cancer and heart disease and so forth than married individuals of the same age. Again, another cultural or social factor affecting sickness and health. All right, let's look at the placebo effect for a few minutes here. since obviously it's a very strong cultural factor that can affect at least perceptions of health. The placebo effect is, of course, the phenomenon whereby a person is administered some substance that is psychoactively inert, yet they claim to undergo some diminution of symptoms. In other words, they claim to feel better. The knee feels better, the headache's gone, whatever the case may be. It's interesting that a cross-cultural study, and we're around page 91 here, it's interesting that a cross-cultural study shows that the placebo success rate actually varies from place to place. And in fact, Hahn reports that in Germany, the placebo effect success rate was much higher than in all the other countries that were tested. And so clearly cultural factors are a great influence here. I want you to refer to a diagram on page 94 in your textbook. Looks like this. And let's take a look at this. So what you see here on the x-axis are health outcomes. Either a person gets better, positive, or worse, negative. And on the y-axis, we see expectations. So we have high expectations in the positive range and low expectations in the negative range. So with the placebo effect, of course, we have a high expectation, and we also have positive health outcomes, and that's exactly what a placebo effect is. High expectations lead to a positive health outcome. So in that part of the graph we see placebo effects. Also we see faith healing, where people do have a very high expectation that healing will occur, and in fact it does by virtue of the faith healing ceremony. Now there's also something called a nocebo effect, and here we're in the bottom left hand quadrant of the diagram. A nocebo effect is where we have negative expectations that lead to negative health outcomes. And of course you see the prime example there, voodoo death, which we discussed. In that case, a person has had the hex put on them, they fear the worst, they expect the worst, and the worst actually happens. So the placebo and the nocebo effects, and it's expectation that's important here. So positive expectations lead to positive outcomes, placebo effect. Negative expectations lead to negative outcomes, the nocebo effect.